So this is the Sat Yoga Ashram's first official Quantumplation weekend, I'm told. And I put the dash in there just to make it more clear that it refers indeed to quantum physics, but it is a continuation of what has been the core activity of all religions, contemplation. The act of a serious Christian is the contemplation of God, contemplative prayer. It's called the highest form of prayer. It corresponds to the yogic term dhyana. And dhyana is the penultimate phase of classical yoga. The final phase is samadhi, which goes beyond the contemplation of God consciousness to unification, merging fully into the realization of the one self without remainder. So the contemplation of the one self has been the core activity of monks and of Sufi mystics and Taoists and Buddhists and Hindus and alchemists and kabbalists, all the esoteric traditions of the perennial philosophy for thousands of years. And we are continuing that, but we want to update the terminology because an extraordinary emergence within the field of science in the last 100 or so years, which is referred to as quantum physics, has completely changed the nature of human understanding. That puts it once again in alignment with the ancient traditions, and yet actually gives more insight if we understand quantum physics and its implications, even than we were able to get from the ancient teachings, because we are now removed from the context in which those ancient teachings were developed. And they were developed when the ego in its current form was not yet existent. And this is what makes the ancient teachings in their original form less digestible to the postmodern consciousness. But quantum physics is entirely digestible, even though the power system has chose to allow as little as possible of quantum understanding to be trickled down into the educational system and society at large. But more and more popular books with a clear understanding of its implications are being published, and speakers who are physicists and who have understood accurately those implications, beginning with Max Planck himself, the founder of quantum physics, back in the early 1900s, recognized that the first major implication of quantum physics is that we can no longer accept the philosophical paradigm of materialism. Materialism developed in the modern age gradually from the 17th century, as the world was coming out of the medieval period, and philosophy in the West, at least Western Europe, had been limited to the scholastic works of Aquinas and others who were elucidating the implications of the Bible and the miracles of Christ and that sort of thing, and trying to come up with a philosophy entirely based on those texts. But a breakthrough happened in the field of philosophy that became most, let's say, effective with the work of René Descartes, who began his philosophy with no reference at all to the New Testament or the Old or to religion per se, and began with the recognition that there seemed to be two types of elements to reality, two types of substances, or res, to use the Latin. There was res extensa, which is stuff that's extended, things that are extended in space and time, and res cogitans, or cogitans if you prefer, that thing which is, we think in our head, that is not extended in space or time, but is able to think. But in this division between matter, the extended stuff, and the thinking stuff, which for the first time had been separated. Before that, in the medieval worldview, it was understood that everything was alive with spirit. It was a panentheistic approach. Everything is alive and conscious. The stars are conscious, the moon, the sun, and that's why astrology made sense in that context. And animals, the word comes from anima, the soul. They had souls. They are ensouled beings. Even the plants were considered conscious, and they are, of course. But all of that came to an end very gradually with the Cartesian approach. And Descartes, however, still realized that something was required to bridge the gap between res extensa and res cogitans, and for that he used the figure of God, from whom both of these types of things derive. But as the modern age developed, the seeming need for God as the organizer of the relationship between these two types of things became less necessary, and the scientific community gradually abandoned the theory now of God's existence, and we were left with beings who can think about a world that is entirely material, without soul, without spirit, a dead world. And the only thing that was seemingly alive in that world was non-physical. And that soon then got overturned when the modern materialism said the thinking thing is not immaterial, it's actually the brain itself, which is through its neuronal, chemical, electrical activity producing consciousness. And so voila, now there is only res extensa. Even consciousness itself is simply an illusion created by an extended cerebrum. So it became a soulless, empty world, and then that was, of course, supplemented by Darwinism, saying it was all random chance and no meaning whatsoever to the whole thing. And then, of course, pretty soon it became quite famous with Nietzsche's cry that God is dead, that whatever kind of metaphysics that one wanted to entertain was also necessarily an illusion. There's only matter in motion, and that brought in, of course, Karl Marx, overturning Hegel and declaring that dialectical materialism was the only approach to life that made sense. And of course, whether one was within a communist camp or a capitalist camp, both were materialist equally. They were slightly different versions of the same metaphysical or non-metaphysical, anti-metaphysical position. Well, all of that was fine so long as physics was held to the Newtonian paradigm. And with Newton, of course, there was still God, but he was the famous watchmaker who wound the whole thing up and then went on vacation and was unnecessary. So once the materialists got in there, of course, they still had to figure out how the clock got wound up, but they made up something called the Big Bang. And with that free miracle, as McKenna says, from then on they could use cause and effect without requiring any intervention from any divine essence. But things did not hold together very long. It was back in 1905 with both Einstein and Max Planck and the work of Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell and later on Nikola Tesla, that the quantum paradigm was shifted the possibility of holding that materialist belief system any longer. So this is an introductory weekend, so I'm not going to go very deeply into quantum physics, or we'll never get to meditate. And so I'm going to try to give a nutshell version of it, even though in our longer retreats we are going to go ever more deeply into the scientific side of this, because quantum physics is actually a theory of consciousness and of how consciousness manifests the illusion of a universe.